Like, it costs so little to start a podcast, and it's something that pretty much anyone with a laptop and a $40 microphone can do. And so it very quickly just balloons. There are currently 660,000 podcasts, and more than 500,000 of those are still current. Like, they're still adding episodes to the 28 million episodes that are out there. And it's a growing medium as well. So right now, 51% of people in America have listened to at least one podcast, and that is A, a lot of people, but B, a growing number of people. So this chart is from 2013 to 2019, and in 2013, fewer than just over 10% of Americans were listening to podcasts, so it's grown dramatically in the last 5 years. One of the reasons so many people like podcasts is because podcast listeners are loyal. When people find a podcast that they like, they keep listening. In fact, they'll go back to the beginning and they'll binge any episode that's still in there, and then they'll go tell their friends about it. Word of mouth is one of the big ways that podcasts spread. So if you have a group of loyal listeners, A, they're going to stay listeners, but B, they're going to help you reach new people and new audiences. So you can kind of see it's fairly evenly split between women and men. It's still a little more male-oriented. And in fact, podcast creators tend to be more men than women, although that is changing as well. Because there are so many podcasts, so many different styles, so many different genres of podcasts, I thought that the way that I would start today is to tell you about the two podcasts that I've created, because they're both different in style, in audience and goals, and then kind of take a step back and talk about the industry more broadly and what scholars can get out of it. So the first podcast I created is called Past Present. When I decided to leave the traditional tenure track back in 2015, I was thinking about what I was going to miss, particularly for teaching, because I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to be in a teaching role for quite some time, and I haven't been for the past 4 years. And I thought about what I got out of teaching, right? I was really going to miss talking about history, talking about new ideas in history, that kind of performative thing you get out of teaching. I was going to miss all of that, and I thought about podcasting as a way to fulfill some of those needs that I was going to lose when I was out of the classroom. And I talked to a friend of mine, Neil Young, and he said, I've been wanting to start a podcast with you. I just never got around to asking you. And so we decided that we would work on this project together. We brought in one of his friends, another historian named Natalia Melman-Petrozella. We're like, do you want to do a podcast with us? And she was like, yes, what's a podcast? And so we introduced her to the world of podcasting, and we created Past Present as a conversational style podcast. So it's the three of us talking about events in the news. We talk about 3 events every episode, or 3 ideas every episode, in about 8 to 10 minute segments. So each episode runs about 45 minutes to an hour. We just taped one this morning talking about the Mueller report, talking about electoral college reforms and how likely they are, and talking about arugula, the leafy green that Americans have never really taken to. And so we do a whole range of culture and pop culture and politics, and kind of a mishmash, and we do it in a conversational style. Like, we just talk about these ideas. And the thing that we bring to the table as scholars is that even though we're not sitting there having a deeply rooted academic conversation, we bring to those topics a historical sensibility. So how do historians think about something like the Mueller report, especially when we only have the Barr memo? Like, how do you even begin to wrap your mind around this? And we launched in October of 2015. We have about 20,000 listeners, and we release weekly. So we just recorded our 173rd episode. I want to play you just a short clip from an episode we released last week, or I guess we released on Tuesday of this week, to give you a sense of what it sounds like. In this case, we're talking about the New Zealand shooting. And one of the things that we were talking about was the global nature of white supremacy and white terrorism. So this is just like a minute and a half, 2 minutes to give you a sense of what a podcast like this sounds like. Like the Camp of the Saints, which has become the Bible of this new wave of white power terrorism and white power activism. That was a book written in French that's about an invasion of France from the hordes of Africa and the Middle East, that kind of language that should sound very familiar to historians of the United States. But that book has been really popular. Not only Steve Bannon and other folks in the United States who really like it and talk about it, Steve King of Iowa talks about it quite a lot, but is popular in all of these different places around the world where these white power movements are thriving. And it is indeed that international and global network that is so important to understanding white power activism today, but that itself is not really new. I mean, when we talked about the white man's burden and the imperial project of Britain in the 19th century, that too had these same underlying beliefs that we needed to make these spaces nations governed by and for white people.
Well, I guess, Nikki, that's my question. Like, why do you think it's been so difficult for people to conceptualize this threat as a global threat? I mean, if you kind of compare it to the conversation of the last 2 decades about so-called radical Islam, I mean, that has always, I think, operated in a context of understanding of this as a global phenomenon, one that takes place in networks outside of traditional, state actors, right? And if anything, one of the big criticisms of the Bush administration's approach to this was that it was approaching this so much on kind of the traditional grounds of nation-state actors, right? But why has there not been that corresponding understanding of white power as a global movement, especially when you are pointing to really the long history of this? There's always operated around those global networks.
So that goes on as a conversation, but as you can tell, it's not scripted in any way. We're not using a lot of academic language. We're really just having a conversation and exploring a set of ideas about white nationalism, white terrorism, white supremacy. That's one of our heavier topics. We don't always go quite so heavy, but it's a more relaxed and casual way of talking about it while still spanning a lot of historical ideas, right? From the release of the Camp of the Saints in the 1970s and that form of anti-immigrant, xenophobic white power, to British imperialism, which is in many places a much more accepted form of white nationalism and white power. That's a very different sound and style from the other podcast that I've created called A12. A12 is about Charlottesville in 2017, the white nationalist attacks of August 11th and August 12th there. And so a couple of things to know. First of all, one of my expertise as a journalist is on the alt-right. I was writing about the alt-right in 2015, 2016, and I also live in Charlottesville. I work at the University of Virginia. I live about 2 or 3 blocks away from where the rally took place on August 12th. And because I'm a columnist at Vox, my editor called me up on the morning of August 12th. And he was like, why don't you go down and cover the events that are unfolding there? Because you have this expertise, you're there on the ground, let us know what's happening. And so I was there for both the violence at the park and then the aftermath of the terrorist attack that day. And I wrote about it a lot, I thought about it a lot. I dealt with the trauma of that day a lot. And at the beginning of 2018, I was spending a lot of time thinking about how to engage publicly with the unusual position that I was in as someone who was an expert on the alt-right, a historian who could dig deeply into these questions of history and memory, and who was also personally affected by the events of that day. That's a space that traditional scholarly forms don't really allow us to blend. We're not supposed to talk about our personal traumatic experiences at the same time that we're talking about our scholarship and the ideas we work on as historians. So I thought for a while about doing some writing in some sort of memoir blended kind of way, and it didn't work. I spent 3 months trying to make it work, and it wasn't working. And one day I just thought, what if I made this into a podcast? it would give me a chance to do a couple of things. It would give me a chance to bring in other people's voices. Because one of the things that I was running up against was, this isn't just my story, right? This is a story of a lot of people who live in this town. But it would also have a kind of intimacy. I mean, that's one of the powers of podcasting, right? Like, you're living in someone's ear, and there is a closeness and an intimacy that can create. I didn't want it to be a conversational podcast. I wanted it to be a narrative podcast where I could tell this story, dive into the history, really unpack it in a very careful way. And so over the course of the next 3 months, I interviewed probably about 24 people for about 30 to 35 hours worth of interviews about their experiences, about their expertise. So I talked to scholars and witnesses and city leaders, all these different people, and then cut it all together into 6 narrative episodes. So I'm going to play you just the very first part of the very first episode to give you a sense of how different a narrative scripted podcast can sound.
Here is what I remember most about that day. The sound of low hovering helicopters, the choking taste of smoke and pepper spray, the echoing crack of clubs against a young man's skull. A wail of terror, a street clogged with bodies and blood. Here's what I don't remember: how I got from the scene of the car attack to the safety of the downtown mall. There's a hole in my memory. The day shifts from scenes of technicolor horror, and then nothing. It's the kind of hole that you know is there, but don't quite know its size or shape. It's like when you fall asleep watching television. When you wake up, you know you've missed part of the story, though you don't know how much or how important what you missed was, just that you missed something. The story of Charlottesville on August 12th is a story about memory. It's a story about trauma, about power and resistance. And it's a story about stories, whose get told and whose get forgotten. The battle in Charlottesville, a literal battle, one in which 3 people died, was a war against forgetting, and a war against remembering. And I wanted to find out why it happened, and what happened to my memories of that day. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, and made by history at the Washington Post, I'm Nicole Hemmer, and this is A12.
All right, and then it goes into the introduction and everything. Anyway, that's a very different sounding podcast. It's a very different kind of tone. And it also has a lot more going on in terms of production, right? Bringing in different kinds of sounds to underscore the storytelling. The reason that I wanted to play both of those for you is because I wanted to begin to highlight what a broad range of things you can do with audio. You can tell big stories. One thing that scholars do really well, I think, is tell good stories that have analysis woven through them, but doesn't necessarily put the analysis forward. But we also bring different perspectives to all sorts of questions and topics that I think there's a real audience for. And I think that more academics and more scholars should be engaging in this kind of medium. If you want more concrete reasons why you should start a podcast, one way to think of podcasting is a way of reaching new audiences, people who you normally wouldn't be talking to. You can make a podcast that's for other scholars, and there's a real value in that. There's a podcast called something like the New Books Network, where it's about introducing scholars to other scholars' work. I believe Matt Grossman has a political science podcast where he talks to the author of a new article that's just come out so that they can share their findings, and so that a scholar driving in to work that day can listen to that podcast. They can always go and read the article as well, but this is an easy entryway into new people's ideas and new people's work. And for scholars who are used to talking to one another and used to talking to students, this is a way to reach different kinds of public. And we'll talk about this because you can reach a lot of different kinds of audiences, but you have to think, I think, very carefully about which audiences you're reaching out to. Podcasts can be a great way of debating ideas, sitting down and talking to other scholars or talking to journalists, talking to people from other fields, and really working through and thinking aloud about different ideas. Interview podcasts are actually really great. We'll talk about different types of podcasts, but interview podcasts are really great for this. As with something like 812, it's a way to engage in new creative projects. One of the things that I loved about doing the 812 podcast was it stretched me in terms of my skills, it stretched me in terms of storytelling, it stretched me in terms of art, and we don't always get that from our scholarship. And the ability to be creative in new and different ways can be really exciting. And it can also help you for building a brand. As I was leaving formal academia, I was doing a lot more public-facing work, and past present wasn't just about scratching that teaching itch, it was also about engaging the public in new and innovative ways, in ways that were, quote unquote, on brand for me. I was building a brand as somebody who brought history to current day topics, and that's what we do in that podcast. So it helped reinforce the kind of scholar that I wanted to be. The whys are probably pretty apparent. You're here for a reason, I would imagine. How to podcast is an entirely different question. And I want to talk you through kind of how to create a podcast, the different things to think about. And I think the very first thing you have to think about before all of the nuts and bolts is your concept. And when it comes to talking about a concept, the very first thing that you have to think about is not necessarily your expertise, but your interest. What is it that you care about? What is it that you're passionate about? What is it that excites you and gets you out of bed in the morning? Those are the kinds of things that will lay the foundation for a really good podcast. And then see where your expertise lies. And the reason that I flip those in that way, interest and then expertise, is because for many people, you actually have a much broader expertise than you think when you think about yourself as a scholar or as a thinker. I'm a historian of conservative media, and that's definitely something that I'm passionate about. It's something that I'm interested in, but it is by no means the limits of my expertise, right? My expertise is on American politics, but it's also just on American history. Those of us who have come up through graduate school have very broad expertise that we're used to thinking about in very narrow ways. So if you let your interest be your guide, you can then kind of do a double check to make sure that you have the expertise, but odds are you have the expertise. And you're also, if you've come up through college and graduate school, your ability to gain expertise in an area is also a skill that you have. Once you have a sense of these things, like where you're most interested in talking about or sharing or exploring, then's the time to think about who your audience is. And a lot of people, publishers deal with this as well. A lot of people, when they're asked, like, who is your audience for this project? They're like, everyone. I want everyone to listen to my podcast. The common man is my audience for this. And that's great. Not super targeted in terms of how you're thinking about audience. And that's why I think it's actually really useful to push yourself when you're thinking about audience. Are you trying to talk to students? Is this something that you might use in the classroom? Are you trying to speak to other scholars? That's going to shape the kind of language that you use and the kind of topics that you cover. Are you trying to talk to whiskey aficionados, right? If you're doing like an alcohol podcast. I'm sure there are a million great beer podcasts out there. Like, who is your audience? Who do you envision sitting down and listening to your podcast and thinking about that in very specific and targeted ways? Because the clearer idea you have in your mind of who's slipping in their earbuds and listening to what it is you have to say, the better the product is going to be, the more targeted the product is going to be, and the better chance that you're actually going to land with the audience that you've imagined. And all of that will ultimately dictate the style of your podcast, right? If you're talking to students, you're going to talk in a different way than you talk to scholars. If you are looking to explore a story, then a narrative podcast is going to make more sense probably than an interview style podcast. If you're just interested in like what the latest thinkers are thinking, an interview podcast is the way to go. So allowing the answers to these different questions shape what you ultimately imagine as your podcast. This is kind of a quick breakdown. There are probably more styles than this. But Past Present is a conversational podcast. If you listen to Political Gabfest out of Slate, if you listen to NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour or Politics Podcast, these are conversational style podcasts where you imagine the listener as the other person sitting at the table. You want them to feel like they're part of the conversation, even if they're not participating in it. You want them to be yelling at their iPhone when they're listening. The narrative style podcast is more like A12. It's like, there are so many good narrative podcasts out there. Any podcast that sort of tells a story and that's scripted and pulled together. There's one that I've been talking about a lot lately is the podcast called Believed, which is about the Larry Nassar abuse case. And that's kind of a mix between narrative and interview based, but it like takes you from the beginning of a story and it narrates you through in a really clear and compelling way. And then interview-based podcasts are ones where you're like reaching out and you're talking to different people every week, having conversations with them, having them share their expertise, their insights, whatever the topic is, you connect with them in some way. You can do this kind of stuff. We'll talk about the equipment and all of that. You can do that in studio, but actually there's equipment now. I did a lot of interviews for the A12 podcast. And some of those were with people who would come in studio. So there was a little jerry-rigged studio at UVA. So I would just have them come in and talk to me on mics. You can do it over the phone. Everyone who has a smartphone has a recording device that can get you really good quality audio. Sometimes when I do NPR interviews, they just have me use my smartphone, record into voice memos, and send it to them. And it's really great quality audio. And then I also have, as I'll show you, a little kit that I take out if I'm going to interview somebody out on the road. But there are lots of different ways to do that, and it's all very accessible if you have the right equipment. The one most important thing that any podcaster needs is a good microphone. A good microphone is what's going to get you quality sound, and that doesn't have to cost very much money. I'll show you my kit that I use when I podcast. I'll show you what each of these is. Good quality microphone like this. This retails now on Amazon for about $60. I think I got mine for $40. It's the Audio-Technica dynamic mic. There are dynamic mics and there are compressor mics. I think a dynamic mic is a great one to use because it captures your voice in really quality ways. Anyway, it's a USB mic, so I can just plug it into my computer, basically plug and play. This is the most important part of my kit for our weekly podcasting. And then a really good pair of earphones. This is kind of whatever. The earphones are negotiable, but little earbuds have sound leak. And so if you're talking to someone else during your podcast, so there are three of us who do our podcast, so we're talking all the time. And if somebody's voice is leaking out of my earphones, then it gets into my recording. So if you have noise canceling earphones, they're awesome. You should have them anyway. They're great on planes. They're not a must-have, but they can be helpful if you're working with other people. They also help for playing back the audio and listening to the sound and making sure there isn't any noise pollution in the recording. We use our laptops when we do past present. I did all of the mixing for A12 on my laptop. For people who are out on the road, sometimes they like to use digital recorders. And I'll show you. This is my digital recorder. I would use this for interviews that I did offsite. It looks like an intimidating piece of equipment. You plug a microphone into it. It records onto an SD card. It's very, very, very easy to use. It's really easy to use, but this is how you go out on the road with your show, and that's the mic that I use with that. The omnidirectional dynamic mic here. Those last two things are much more expensive pieces of equipment. This is what reporters use when they go to report out on the scene. I think the Zoom H5 is a couple $100, and that mic is about $180. Noise canceling headphones range a lot in price. And again, this is about $60 for the microphone. But really, this and a laptop, you can record a podcast. And you can understand why people are so into podcasting, because it doesn't cost that much money to do. And then the last thing that you need is editing software. You've got to have a way to put all of this together. I'm going to talk to you about various types of editing software. If you're entry-level podcasting, I'm going to show you what Audacity looks like. I recommend Audacity. It doesn't cost anything. It's free. I did both. We record past present on Audacity. I did A12 on Audacity. I have radio producer friends. They wanted to kill me for using Audacity for A12. It is not intuitively good for massive mix projects. So for A12, right? If I'm including 20 interview clips and then sound clips for the background and then my own clips from my narration, that's a pretty messy process of putting together a lot of different sound files. There are some programs that do that more easily than others. You can do it on Audacity, and that's the big takeaway that I want you to have. You can do this on free software. If you would prefer to upgrade, Hindenburg Journalist is the one that most podcast producers would recommend if you're looking to get at something that's a little more, has a little more range that you can do a little more with. If you really want to get fancy about it, you can use Adobe Audition. This is subscription-based, so you're going to be paying $30 a month for as long as you have it. Or you can use Pro Tools. You can buy it for $600 plus a $100 fee every year. Pro Tools, people will talk about it as kind of like the Cadillac of podcast editing software, but really it's for people who do professional audio and even movies and things like that. So if you have money that's burning a hole in your pocket, I still wouldn't actually recommend it. You know what? Because it actually takes a lot to learn how to use. I would say that in terms of not just in terms of price, but in terms of ease of picking it up, the learning curve, these are probably listed appropriately as well. I'll show you what Audacity looks like, and I will tell you, when I decided to start a podcast, I had never done any kind of audio editing in my life. I didn't know how to do it. The internet is great because it can teach you how to do just about anything. If you've been through college and graduate school, you know how to research and learn things, and this is no exception. Let me see if I can show you my Audacity. There it is. So this is Audacity. This is the recording still I did this morning. Honestly, for something like this, all you have to do is plug in your microphone and hit record, and it will record your voice as you go along. With our podcast, because there are three of us who live in different states, so my co-host Neil lives in Florida, my co-host Natalia lives in New York, and I live in Virginia and other places. We each record into our laptop. And so then you have three audio files, right? You have Neil's audio file, mine, and Natalia's. And then whoever's doing the production, I did the production for the first 2 years, Neil's doing it now. You just take those three files, and you put them all together, and you line them up to make sure everyone's talking when they should be talking. You take out all of the parts where we're like, oh, I don't know what to say next. What do you guys want to talk about? You take out that kind of stuff, you clean it up a bit, and then it's mixed, right? It's all in the same file. And it's extremely easy to do. It's a very intuitive system, and you can watch a few YouTube videos, read a few websites, and know how to do it, which makes it pretty much the easiest form to use. All right, Audacity. Sorry, let me just get back in here. There we go. So choosing the software is a big decision to make right from the beginning because each one of them takes a little bit of time to learn. Choose your software. Recording the tracks, again, is just a matter of having a good microphone and learning how to use it. And that just requires practice. Staying about 3 to 4 inches away from your microphone, speaking directly into it, listening to your levels. So if those of you who are like really eager to go do a podcast soon, you want your sound levels to be between -9 and -12. Audacity and other places will show you when you're blowing out the sound because it'll go into a red range as you're recording. But recording tracks is actually really easy. As long as you have a good microphone, your sound quality is going to be good. You have to minimize background distractions. You have to turn off your air conditioning or your heat. Like my apartment's going to be really cold when I get back because I recorded the podcast this morning, forgot to turn the heat back on. So, but to minimize those background sounds. But if you have a good directional mic like this, dynamic mic, it'll capture mostly just your voice and it will minimize background sounds. The other thing I want to mention, because you hear it some in the A12 podcast, is about adding sounds in. The one caveat to this is anytime you're adding in a sound, you have to know what your copyrights are. Copyright is huge when it comes to podcasting. You can't just use Beyonce for your opening music. Call Your Girlfriend is a popular podcast that used a copyrighted song for their opening music, and then the podcast took off, and then the music company came after them, and they had to pay a whole bunch of money in order to keep having that as their intro music. The fair use law around this, if you're going to talk about a product, a film, a song, something like that, in a substantial way, then you can use up to a 30-second clip fair use. So when we talk about Beyonce's Formation on our podcast, then we can use up to a 30-second clip of her song. But we have to talk about it substantively. Otherwise, you have to go to free music sites. There are a lot of music and sound options available under Creative Commons. But you just have to know with each thing that you're using what the licensing rights are. Or you can make your own sounds. I wrote the intro music for both of our podcasts. I don't have a music background, but I do have GarageBand on my computer and actually like tool around with that a little bit. And you can put together something that sounds good, clean, professional. If you have a keyboard or something like, or a guitar that you can plug in, you can record your own sounds, but I would assume if you're at that level of a musician, you know how to do that better than I do. But your own stuff, right? You can use as much as you want. You don't have to worry about copyright protections. Then there's the matter of how you get your podcast out into the world. A podcast becomes a digital file, like an episode, once it gets edited down, generally into an MP3. Most podcasts are distributed as MP3s because it's a small enough file to send out into the world. So you might record in RAW or AUP or WAV or something like that. You're going to mix it down and finally turn it into an MP3. And then it has to live somewhere on the internet. So you need some kind of hosting service. And hands down, the one that I recommend is Libsyn. The cost varies depending on how much space you need. We release 4 to 5 episodes a month, and so we pay, I think, between $10 and $20 a month for the hosting service. Libsyn is great because you just upload your episode, fill in a little bit of information, and it then sends it to all of the places you want it to go. And you want it to go to a lot of places because not everybody uses the same podcast distributor. Obviously, the big one is iTunes. Gotta get it to go to iTunes. Google Play for Android users, but there are also places like Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify is now getting into the podcasting game, TuneIn. There are a bunch of other smaller ones, but these are like the big ones that you want to make sure that you're sending your podcast out to, because what's the point in having a podcast if you're not sending it out into the world somehow? These kind of smartphone distributors are really great. It also helps to have a website that you can also kind of keep your podcasts on for people like my mom who they don't know how to use iTunes, but they know how to go to the website and check it out. So we have, my aunt is a nun, and the whole convent listens to the podcast, but they all listen to it online because they don't have smartphones. So all of it lives online for us too. And it's important to have a website for a couple of reasons, but one reason is, A, it's a place to host. It's also a place where you can keep show notes, depending on what kind of podcast that you're doing. But in our case, for each episode, we include different links to stuff that we talked about, especially for history books that we mentioned or things like that. We want to make sure that our listeners can go and find the people we refer to and the writing that we refer to. And so that's a good place. We'll talk more about websites in a second. It's a good place to have as well. And so that's going to cost you another, if you use Squarespace, $5 to $10. And those are monthly costs, right? So if you're adding this up in your head, $50, $60 for a mic, that's your minimum there. $20 a month for hosting fees and website fees. Some of those things you might be able to get through your university, especially for things like website hosting. All right. There's another phenomenon that I wanted to talk to you about, which are podcast networks. So especially if you are thinking about going into podcasting, this is something you're going to want to think about, because one of the things that's happened in the past 3 or 4 years is that in the podcasting industry, there's been the development of podcast networks. These are networks that are sort of groups of shows that have the support of internal communities. So there are little ones like Pineapple Street Media. All these have been consolidating lately. So I think Spotify bought Panoply, iHeartMedia bought one of the other big ones. There are a lot of different podcast networks out there. The names are changing a lot right now, and a lot of them have various foci. Like Maximum Fun is comedy podcasts. So if you're looking to do something in the humor vein, then maybe you talk to a place like Maximum Fun. If you're looking to do kind of lefty wonky liberal podcasts, maybe you talk to the folks at Crooked who do Pod Save America and those kinds of things. What podcast networks want when they're developing new shows? One, they want you to be famous. So if you're famous, that helps a lot. 2, they need to know that it's something they can sell. So for a lot of people, none of my podcasts have been through a podcast network. None of them have been monetized. But if you have a really great story or a really great idea, you might be able to get in with a podcast network. Particularly right now, true crime is huge. So if you know a wild true crime story, then you might be able, even as a non-famous person, to get a podcasting network on your side. The benefits of a podcasting network is that you have a team of people who are working to do the production, who are working to do the development, and who, perhaps most importantly for them, are working on doing the monetization. Monetizing podcasts is really hard. It's not easy money right from the get-go. There are a lot of sponsors who will work with different podcasts, but for podcast networks, the buy-in is usually 35,000 listeners an episode. Once you have that many listeners, they're like, yes, we know how to make money off of this. Lower than that, it gets a little tricky. That doesn't mean you can't go out and hustle and find sponsors. If you're under that level, you certainly can. But just in case some of you had dollar signs floating in your eyes, it does require quite a large following in order to make that happen. Which is why it's important to know how to build an audience. It's not just important to know for monetization purposes, but if you're spending your time making something, you want people to listen to it. You want to have some kind of audience. It doesn't necessarily mean you need a big audience. If you're making it for your students, congratulations, you have a built-in audience. Amazing. If you're making it for other scholars, like maybe you're only trying to reach 50 people. Maybe you're only trying to reach 200 people. That's why identifying who your ideal audience is really important. So you have a sense of like, how big do you want it to be? For something like A12, my audience was a mix. Like, I wanted people in Charlottesville to want to listen to it, in part because it was their story, in part because there were a lot of people in town who knew kind of the broad strokes of what had happened, but there was a much deeper history, a much more significant amount of activism that was happening in the city that even people who lived in the city weren't aware of. And because this was the story of our city and our experiences, the city of Charlottesville, the people who live there, were part of my audience. As somebody who writes on the alt-right and writes about rising white nationalism and white terrorism, like people who are interested in that were part of my target audience. And so reaching out to the different places where I had written about rising white nationalism was important. So figuring out who your audience is and who your networks are. When we first launched Past Present, Neil, Natalia, and I figured out every single historian we knew, and they all got an email when the podcast launched. And that was for a few different reasons. One, they were a big part of our target audience. Like, our podcast isn't just for historians, but we wanted to make sure it was good enough that historians would want to listen to it. And we do have a lot of historians in our network. We reached out to the journalists that we work with because we thought a lot of political journalists might be interested in what we were doing. And one reason why it's important to use your network is not just to build your audience, but for something like iTunes. Here's a trick of the trade. If you get on New and Notable in iTunes, which is something you can qualify for in your first 2 weeks as a live podcast, all of a sudden your podcast is going to be visible to everyone, right? Again, there are 660,000 podcasts. Not all of them break through into the public eye. If you're one of the 10 podcasts on New and Notable on iTunes, people see that. That's a great way to get new listeners. So how do you do that? Well, there are a few ways to game the system or to prove to the system that you are new and notable. If you release 3 episodes right at the start, that's an important component of it. You need to get your friends and your network to then subscribe to your podcast, to download those 3 episodes, and then to come back and leave a rating and a comment. We had our network do that, and we were instantly on New and Notable. And that helped build us right away. And because you can only be on New and Notable in your first 2 weeks, you got to get on it, right? There's a limited time to make this happen. And so there's a lot of work that goes on beforehand to make sure that your network is ready to jump when you release it. Again, if you're not looking for a broad popular audience, that's okay. You don't have to do this in that way. But if you are trying to attract a broader range of listeners, that's a great way to do it and take advantage of the algorithms of iTunes. Creating a community space. We haven't done this a ton with our podcast, but I actually think it can be really important, especially if you have kind of an ongoing podcast. Like A12 is short, episodic, it's 6 episodes, release them all, and I was done futzing with it. For something like Past Present, it's week after week after week. Creating places, whether it's a Facebook community or a Reddit community or just some kind of online space where the people who listen to your podcast can talk to one another, can talk about the show that they really love to listen to. Again, podcast audiences are incredibly loyal. So giving them a space to share their enthusiasm, not only with the broader world, but with one another, can help create a podcast community. And the Maximum Fun Network is amazing at this. They're really good at making those communities. There's a podcast called By the Book, where the hosts read one self-help book a week and then go live by it. They have a robust online community, right? And their audience is people who love to read self-help books. They have a very clearly defined audience. They have a very loyal audience who go onto Facebook and talk about the books that the hosts are living by. So creating that kind of community, and you can do that on your website as well. That can be a place where you attract different listeners to, but you have to be willing to engage them, right? When they ask you questions, you have to respond right away. When they leave comments, you have to respond right away. And then if you're really interested in continuing to engage with an audience, developing forms of audience buy-in. And by that I mean, if you listen to a podcast and they're like, we wanted to share the listener comment of the week, or we're going to have a, so the Political Gabfest does this, where we're going to share one really great nugget that was shared with us by a listener this week. That's a way for somebody who listens to show up on the podcast. And that's really exciting for listeners because, again, they're loyal. They love the podcast. They want to be part of it. So having ways for listeners to participate is actually a great way of building a loyal community, a lasting community, and ultimately a way of creating audience buy-in. One of the big ways that podcasters who aren't quite at monetization levels help to monetize their podcast are things like Patreon, where people can donate on a monthly schedule to help support the podcast. We have Patreon for Past Present. And if you've created this kind of audience buy-in, then you can also get literal audience buy-in. Like they want to support the project that you're doing. And Patreon is one way of measuring that support. All right, I think that covers all the very many parts of podcasting. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you for your presentation.
Of course.
I'm actually a PhD student that released my first podcast last week.
Congratulations! How does it feel?
You know, a lot of edits this week. So,
Yeah.
So my research is on food trucks and just hearing how they get into the industry and how the food they cook actually save their lives and how they're doing it to improve the lives of other people. The question that I have is about how you reached out to other scholars. And so what was the buy-in that you used for them? Was it more of, hey, this is a great podcast that I hope you listen to, or I would like for you to be on the show?
So it depends on what the style of the podcast is. If you are doing interviews and there's somebody that you want to interview, I think scholars are now used to getting these emails where you just email them, say, I read X, Y, and Z that you've written. I think you'd be a great voice to add to this podcast. Here's what it is we do, like a really short explanation of what the podcast is, what it's doing, and asking if you can have 20 minutes of their time or a half hour of their time, something like that. If it's just kind of spreading the word, you could just send an email and let people know that you have this exciting new project out. I think that for some of us, self-promotion is really hard, and we're timid about doing it. Natalia is so on to self-promotion, and I'm I don't know, I don't want to bother people with my podcast. But getting over that, I think, is important. And the way that you get over it is just to do it again and again and again and again. And so the people who you think are going to be interested in that, just send them an email. And then if there are message boards, I know that there are like HNet has I think it has a food history section, or whatever community of scholars, if they have a space online that you can reach out to, that's great. Printing up business cards, and when you go to a conference, handing them out, letting people know. I remember when Liz Covart, who does Benjamin Franklin's World, a podcast, the first time I met her, I remember it well because she handed me a bookmark and she was like, listen to my podcast. And she was just, when she would meet people at conferences, she would promote the project that she was working on. And it's a bit of a hurdle to get over, but that's how I would do it. And just know that scholars are used to getting emails from people who are asking for interviews. So don't worry that you're asking too much of them. And I know for some people, as a graduate student, you can feel like there's a hierarchical line that you're not supposed to cross. You can cross it. It's perfectly okay to ask assistant professors, associate professors, senior professors, just for a project like this that's public facing, call them, Professor so-and-so in the subject line or in the beginning of the email. But know that you, as somebody who's producing something for the public, have a right to contact them, and that you're actually offering them an opportunity, right? You're giving them a chance to get their work out there, and that's a boon for them. And congratulations. What's your podcast called?
The Food Truck Scholar.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to listen to it because food trucks are amazing.
Thank you, yes, for your presentation. I kind of have two questions. One in particular for like the cadence of episodes. So, in your experience and your other listening of other podcasts, how often do you think is best for a successful podcast to gain traction, to kind of build that audience? Is it every week or every other week, or kind of just about that too?
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, there's a broad range. And so this is not necessarily a make or break question. There are podcasts that release episodes like every day or 3 times a week. I wouldn't want to do it, but like the Up First podcast, which is just like a recap of the upcoming news on NPR. It's like a 10 to 12 minute podcast, comes out every morning. I think that if you're going to do it more frequently than once a week, you want them to be short. But there are certainly podcasts out there with very loyal followings where you're like releasing 3-hour podcasts a week and they listen to them and want bonus episodes. So I would say once a week is a really good model. Once every other week, also a really good model. For those, you just want to make sure that you're consistent, that your listener knows when to expect you downloaded into their podcast queue. You can do less often than that. And sometimes for like narrative podcasts, so like for A12, I just released all of the episodes all at one time. But for an episodic podcast, once every week or once every 2 weeks, the ones that I listen to come out more or less once a week. And that's great, because then I know it's like Wednesday night and Judge John Hodgman is going to be in my queue, and then I can listen to him regularly. And so our listeners often will tell us, like, I know that I'm going to listen to you on my Tuesday morning commute because we come out at 4 a.m. every single Tuesday. And that can be really valuable. So once every week or once every 2 weeks. And then think about your length in terms of that. Podcast lengths can vary a lot. Like for some people, like a 10-minute podcast is great. How long is your podcast? About 30. I would say like 20 to 30 is starting to become a new norm, although for conversational style podcasts, Pop Culture Happy Hour has now split theirs into 2 a week. So they're like 2 20-minute podcasts, but still like the Gabfest and things are about 45 minutes to an hour. Yeah, and then also solicit listener feedback. Feel free to, you don't have to keep doing the same thing just because you did it one way for your first episodes. You can change over time.
I have 2 questions and I'll ask the first one.
Sure.
In interview type of podcasts, I'm sure I've also heard podcasts where the person you're interviewing is somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that work? So what kind of equipment?
Yeah. So the first kind of equipment you need is some way to talk to them, right? So because I like to have them record into their smartphones, I don't want to be talking to them on their smartphone. I usually will talk to them via Skype or Google Hangouts. There are things like Zencaster. Do you use Zencaster?
I've heard of it, but I was trying
Yeah.
to figure out how to use it if they have their phones. So that's
Yeah, so Zencaster is great because it actually records as you're going. And so for me, that would be like a backup, because if they don't have a mic, if they're recording into their computer, it's going to sound like they're recording into their computer, right? The sound quality is not going to be as good. So what I would usually do is I would interface with them on something like Google Hangouts, like a face-to-face setup, and then have them speak into their smartphones. So the way that you do that, I knew I had it somewhere. You literally just have them go into voice memos on their phone, and iPhones have that integrated in it from the beginning. I believe Androids have it as well. You have them call that up, hit record, be very explicit about the fact that they see that it's recording, and then hold it. One way that I could tell them to hold it is like you're talking into the phone, and then drop it down to your jaw. That's like the right distance to get really good quality sound. Probably stop them depending on how long the interview is, every 10 minutes, because you don't want the sound files to get so large that they can't email them. But Voice Memos has built right into it the the ability to shoot it straight to email. They email you those files. It's great.
I want to piggyback on
Yeah.
that. What about a podcast that would actually be debate style? And when you have people long distance, how do you record that? How do you make that happen?
Well, so you could do it this way. So if it's the same people every week, then everybody just sets up with their kit where they get their microphone and record and share the file at the end. So like for our podcast, it's the same people every week. So we all record into Audacity, and then we upload those files to Dropbox, and the editor just mixes them all together again. If it is a debate-style podcast where it's different folks every week, then I would do it this way. I would have them record into their phones, send you the file, and then you would use Audacity where you just mix them all back together on Audacity. Yeah, and it might sound complicated to do, but it really is just like opening those 3 files. It'll open up the soundtracks for each one. You just line them up so that everybody's speaking when they should be speaking. Really easy to do, and then that's mixed together.
I was just gonna
Yep.
respond. So none of the food trucks that I talk to are here. So I have to, go abroad for that. So one way that you could test this out is a app called Ringer. It's RINGR. And you can use it as a desktop, laptop, tablet, or phone, because Zencaster does not have it set up for phones just yet. I'm using the free version right now, so you can record. They can download it as an app on their phone. They can delete it when they're done, or they can pull up on a tablet and just pull up the web application. You get their email. You put their email in. You can tell them the time and the date. They get the email. It says, hey, you are interviewing this person at this time. You click on the link. It takes them to a chat. Now, what is nice about the free one is that you can record up to a certain amount of hours, each month, and it's free. But the downside to the free version is that it downloads as an MP3 file. And as she was saying, upload your podcast to, an MP3 is great. But when you're trying to audit, edit it, not so much. You kind of want a WAV file or an OGG file. It automatically downloads as an OGG file. What I would recommend doing is getting either the premium or the pro package. What's dope about that is that when you do the premium or the pro, it will download as individual tracks. And so for me, that is crucial. And you can pick the format. You can use OGG, you can use stereo edit, and it sounds like really good. And you can download them, it'll automatically be lined up. And if you want to edit out the sound out of one particular person, you can do that. If you have a person that speaks very soft and you speak very loud, you might want to audit just their track and make it louder, so it's not you bring them up and then you're screaming at the audience.
Right.
So I would kind of suggest maybe them to test it out and see if you like it or not.
Okay.
And to give you a sense of what the mixing looks like, so this is A12, so this is a much more complicated set of mixings. But this is my narration track. This is the track of the theme music. You can see how each track for different interviews and voices is a separate thing. But this is all mixed together, which is to say, if I played it through, all of the voices would come in at the right time. It's just about lining up their voices when I'm not talking. And it is an easy process to do. You just have to kind of play around with it. But mixing is not as difficult as it sounds. It's a lot easier than it looks.
I'm just curious about how you go about the process of the narrative type podcast. Do you write the entire episode? How do you do that?
Yeah, so the question was about narrative style podcasts and how you write them. First of all, let me caveat by saying writing for radio is very different from writing things that are meant to be read. It's the different, if you're giving a talk, you know that you don't write the talk the same way that you will write a paper that is meant to be read. So you have to, there's a great book that NPR put out that's about writing for radio. And if you're committed to doing kind of a narrative style podcast, I recommend reading it just to familiarize yourself with what good writing for radio is. But for me, what I did was I went out and I did all of the interviews, and I had a sense in my mind of what I wanted the narrative arc to look like. like what I wanted each episode to focus on, kind of what story I wanted to thread through the whole thing. I transcribed all of the interviews. I found, I know it took a long time. I found the particular clips that I wanted to use, and often during an interview, like you know the clips you want to use. Like there was this great moment in the first interview that I did where by the end of the first hour, the person I was talking to trusted me. And like it got the interview to this emotional point that I asked her a question and she started crying. And like it was one of those moments where it was like, this is it, right? Like this is the moment that captures everything that she's been saying, like the trauma that she's sharing, what it meant to her. And so I knew I was going to use a clip of that. Like I would take notes after each interview and be like, what were the things that really stuck with me? And then at the end of the day, like, you know, I released 6 episodes that were a little over a half hour a piece. And I had 35 hours worth of interview time. So like a lot of that ends up on the cutting room floor. Once I knew both the story arc I wanted and the clips I wanted to use, then it was about writing around those clips, being able to tell that story and then bring in people's voices, just as you do with academic writing, right? If you're writing something, you're telling a vignette, you're like, which of these like lines am I going to pull out of this letter that I read and weave into it? That process is very much the same, of bringing in those voices and quoting them and things like that and building it around them. And then you just record it, and when you start to record it and you realize you can't say this sentence because it's too convoluted, then you write it again and again and again until you get it right. Oh, and if you're writing about current events like that, one of the things that I very quickly learned was how to write things about criminal cases that are ongoing so as not to get sued. So, also important if you're writing about something where you're describing living people who might be touchy about you calling them a terrorist. Any other questions?
Do you recommend staying like with one type of podcast all through what you're doing? Like if you have a story that you want to tell, but there are certain parts that are more like you can do interviews for, but another part where it would have to be more narrative driven. Is that like a turn off to audience, do you think, or how would you work around it?
Yeah, I don't actually think that's a problem. So the question is like, can you do different kinds of styles within a podcast? If you listen to the Dream podcast. Okay, first of all, this is a great podcast. It's about MLMs, multi-level marketing schemes. And it involves some scripted pieces. So the main host telling her stories, but then she has a person that she's working with who goes out and like tries an MLM scheme and like goes to like the different things. And so she sits down and she like has a conversation with her about it. And she has another person who's an expert on the legal side, and she sits down and she like has a conversation with him. And I think that works really well. If you've listened to NPR's new Through Lines podcast, which is a history podcast, they do kind of a blend of like talking back and forth with one another and then narrating a story. I don't think that that podcast is 100% successful in its style, but you can blend those things. The important thing to keep in mind is audience expectations. So if you're going to be blending styles, you want to introduce that in the first episode. You don't want to like do 3 cleanly scripted episodes and then all of a sudden in the 4th episode it's an interview, because the audience is going to be like, wait, that's not what I was expecting. It's fun to upend audience expectations, but it can be alienating if all of a sudden they're just like, I thought I was here for one thing, now I'm here for this thing, and I don't know that I want to be here for this thing. But I don't think there's a problem with blending styles. Jim?
How do you and your partners on House President hook up to talk the same?
So we use Google Hangouts, like the video chat, and that works really well for us. We've tried Skype and other things, but Skype is so glitchy. We tried to do so much with Skype, like Skype recorder as a backup, all of these things. Well, people should use what they want, but use Google Hangouts or something similar, because that's been very stable for us. Anything else?
You already mentioned this, but how much time per week?
Yeah. Yes. How much time per week? It can take a lot of time. It really depends on what the podcast is, but let me break it down to you for past present. So we over email figure out what our topics are going to be. I then send out a list of readings, 5 or 6 readings for each topic. That usually takes me maybe an hour and a half to find really good readings. Then I send those around. Everybody has to read those readings. That takes a couple of hours. I write up a small script for just the opening of each segment. That takes me between 45 minutes and an hour. If anyone's doing the math here, we're like at 5 or 6 hours already. 1 to 2 hours to record. Now we're at like 8 hours. And then there's the production side of things. When I was producing the podcast, it would take me between 7 and 10 hours to edit. It doesn't have to take that long. Neil now does it, and he's like, I don't care if you said 30 times in the sentence. Anyway, so you can cut down on that time. There are a lot of different factors for cutting down on the time editing takes. Yeah, that was for us, yeah. For an hour-long podcast. Yeah, it doesn't have to take that long, but that's how long my perfectionist brain made it take.
Do you think it's feasible for a student project?
Yeah, I do. Actually, a lot of students are trying them out. Have them do like short podcasts so they don't have to spend as much time on the editing side of things and things like that. But definitely, like because of the kind of plug and play style, they'll pick up Audacity very quickly. And often university libraries will, or some place at the university will have microphones and things like that that they can either borrow or rent. I know University of Miami and UVA have microphones you can just rent. Yeah. There's one other thing that I was going to say. Oh, and then in terms of time for like the A12 podcast. Came up with the idea in mid-April, released the whole thing on August 6th. I was pretty much working around the clock by the end of that. But you could do it in like 3 months. I don't recommend it. Do it over the course of a year. Your life will be much, 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 much saner.
How many episodes was that?
That was 6 episodes.
6 episodes took you essentially from conception to distribution a year.
It took me about from late April to early August. So about 3 months, yeah. But you should take a year. You should take a year just so you're not doing like 5 interviews a day and staying up all night for like 5 days trying to get it out.
So when you mentioned about copyright, just being careful with that, what about sound bites? Like about someone saying something, not
Yep.
music necessarily.
Right, so by and large, you want to talk about what they're saying. But for instance, in our intro, we take 1 line from George W. Bush and 1 line from Jill Lepore and 1 line from Parks and Rec. The copyright police are not coming after us for our 2 seconds of sound that we're using.
So is there a time, like, as long as it's no longer than that, we can use those sound bites even if it has nothing to do, or we're not talking about that?
I would only, it's a gray area when it's such a short clip. It generally doesn't, like nobody's going to come after you, but just know you're in a gray area there. If you're using, it depends on if it's publicly available, actually. Like, is it something that they released on their website? Was it a news event, something like that? You can use clips from that. When it comes to an actual product, like a song or a television show or something like that, now you're taking something that's somebody else's intellectual, or not intellectual, but copyrighted property. Yeah. Yeah. All right, I know that it's Friday and everyone wants to go. If you have questions as you're like processing all of this, I know that I put a lot of information on the slides, like just reach out to me and I will answer any questions that you have. And thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. This was fun.